All right, so when throwing nose down or very nose down or nose neutral, there's similarities in the flight characteristics to putting with those different nose angles. And I'm going to have to re-explain, you know, nose angle in relation to launch angle whenever I'm talking about it for people who haven't seen the other videos. So just to quickly reiterate that, if I'm throwing the disc along this upwards launch angle, the disc is parallel with that launch angle. That's nose neutral. Whatever happens later in the flight, it's because the disc was nose neutral. So nose neutral, when you're throwing it up, you can see the wind can get under it the steeper you throw it. The steeper you throw it, the more wind can get under it as it's going up, and so nose neutral can stall out if you throw it too high. So the steeper you throw, the more you need nose down to avoid stalling. So if you're trying to throw over trees, for example, or over, if you have a high obstacle close in front of you, that's just forcing you to throw higher. So even throwing up a hill, for example, makes you have to throw higher usually. So nose down, if I was throwing it, it's in relation to the launch angle. So this would be extremely nose down. So notice if I'm throwing it up and it's parallel to the ground, that's very nose down. And remember, 4 degrees nose down is considered to be a decent amount of nose angle. That's nose down that's hard to get. So this is like negative, like 30 degrees nose down. And notice it's parallel to the ground. So as it flies up and it hits the apex, it's parallel to the ground, and so now it's gliding, and it looks during the gliding phase like it's nose neutral because it's just gliding forward with the nose angle looking similar to the angle that it's gliding. So you only get flights that look nose neutral later after it's reached the apex if it was very nose down to begin with. And that's what people get confused about because they talk about nose angle, just how it looks later in the flight, but that's a result of what the nose angle was in relation to the launch angle right after it was released. Okay, so the characteristic to kind of identify very nose down is that it reaches the apex more quickly earlier in the flight, and then it just glides after that. Whereas nose neutral is going to keep gliding up to the apex. It's going to keep rising to the apex over a longer portion of time. So it's going to reach the apex later in its flight. And nose up, similarly, will rise even quicker from a lower release angle to hit the apex later in the flight.
Proctor comes over the top of this one and just a bullet.
That's so notice here how quickly it rises, but then also how quickly it hits the apex because it's very nose down.
Proctor comes over the top of this one and just a bullet.
This isn't the best hole because it's downhill, so people are already throwing a little bit differently typically, but it's a good example back to back to see different flight characteristics because of different nose and launch angles. So first, Gossage is going to throw a lower than normal launch angle since it's downhill with something probably close to nose neutral. There's only one throw of him on the Tech Disc website that's slightly nose up, but he's probably throwing anywhere between slightly nose down to slightly nose up normally. And then next is Proctor, where on the Tech Disc site he's got like -7, -8 nose angle. So the flight Gossage gets, it looks like a more direct line, kind of matching the launch angle with the slope of the hill, but probably close to nose neutral. So we see it descend initially, but then the descent kind of slows down and then it glides down more slowly after that.
I would call it a bonus birdie. I've got 3 birdies since 2009.
Really?
Yes, I got my third birdie today.
This card for sure.
I would call it.
Proctor, on the other hand, throws a lower than usual launch angle compared to the first throw that I showed from him. So this time the disc doesn't rise up as much. It still does for a split moment, but it's so nose down that it stops right away with that low launch angle and then descends more quickly with like a downward gliding descent. This is probably more what people would think a very nose down throw would look like instead of the first Proctor throw, which rises up for longer and then hits the apex and then glides straight. That's normal because the launch angle plus the nose angle is still positive. In a throw like this, with a lower launch angle but still a very low nose angle, the launch angle plus the nose angle is probably negative, which normally wouldn't get you enough distance, but this one's downhill.
This is an important one. You get this when you're gaining strokes on the lead card, which is essentially the people close to you.
Ooh.
You get this when you're gaining strokes.
Alright, so here's a good way to practice getting the feeling down for what it feels like to throw nose down by exaggerating it to try to throw very nose down on a soft shot so you can really feel it. So you're going to exaggerate a briefcase and then throw upwards and turn out of the briefcase in the opposite direction to get the nose down. And then you're throwing it upwards so that you can see the disc rise, and then ideally it hits the apex and it looks roughly parallel to the ground, and then it floats forward. If you do that, you've thrown very nose down. So if I were to throw it up at a 20-degree launch angle and it's parallel to the ground, that's going to be like a negative 20-degree nose angle. 10-degree launch angle, negative 10 nose angle, it doesn't look as obvious. It looks like it just kind of goes up and stops right away almost. And find yourself a spot where you have like an approach type of distance, so you're not throwing too hard. Ideally, towards a basket or some sort of aiming point. And make sure you don't accidentally, as you're doing this, you don't accidentally do this and crank over into Annie. You got to keep your posture the same while doing that motion with your arm. You can do this with hyzer posture or anhyzer posture, but if you're not used to it, you might be more tempted to stand out of your hyzer posture and go into anhyzer posture accidentally, so I recommend practicing it with more hyzer posture to resist that urge and isolate the movement more. Also, a cue I've heard Seabass22 on YouTube mention he's used before that might be useful for some people is imagine throwing the top of the disc up towards the ceiling or the sky or whatever. It does kind of feel like that's what I'm doing. I'm just thinking more about the mechanical motion for that. But that would also be a cue, which is a big exaggeration. So you got to ease into it, do it with softer throws first. And the idea is if you get a feel for the exaggeration, then if just a little bit of that motion comes into your normal throw, that's all you need to get enough nose down. Fun fact, even though people who throw with a swooping swing style often have nose-up problems, there's nothing about a swooping swing style that makes it hard to throw nose down if you already know how to throw nose down. I left a miss in here so you can see how high I'm really aiming. Interestingly, a few final thoughts on this tangent about swooping. It does seem to lower my spin, but this is close to my max speed, so it's not significantly reducing my speed. However, it probably doesn't have as much potential for max power. I just don't have enough power yet with my normal form to show that difference, is my guess, because with the swoop you end up having to raise your arm at the end to get the positive launch angle, and it feels more straining to raise the arm with a lot of explosive power compared to concentrating more of that power through the elbow swinging open.